Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatting Cinema. I'm Gianni,
I'm Flynn.
And I'm Luke.
and today we're going to be talking about biopics, kind of what constitutes a biopic, what makes one great, and some of our favorites. So, what to you guys is like a great biopic?
So, a lot of the biopics to me that stand out are ones with unconventional structures or interesting framing devices. I have a few of them on my list of favorites. I think the performance at the center has to be, sort of the centerpiece of it, because if that doesn't work, the whole thing really doesn't work. And I think they really rely on strong writing, a strong understanding of a person's life, a knowledge of when to tell the truthful stop, when to embellish, things like that. So biopics, movies based on true stories, I think getting facts right is important, but it's still in the service of telling a good story. So when the truth is stretched a little bit, when sort of white lies are told, characters are kind of made a little bit more prominent in a person's life, to sort of like speed up timelines and things like that, I think that all is in service of making a good biopic or a movie based on a true story.
For me, I look at biopics in two ways, where I won't watch it unless it's about somebody who faced adversity in their respective field or life, whatever they did, or somebody that's like a larger than life figure, because like you said, it's about that centerpiece character. Yeah. And some of the movies that I've chosen aren't about people that are larger than life, but they made waves in what they did specifically, or they are people who are straight up larger than life. So that's kind of what I look for. And then, I mean, one of them that I watched last night, like they did a very unique format of telling the person's life story, and I also I like that a lot, where you can tell somebody's life from point A to the end, or whatever your end point is, or you can do it in a unique way, which there's a couple that have done it in unique ways.
Yeah. For me, the most successful biopics are the ones that can take these larger than life characters and people, and bring them down to earth and like show us their human sides and their really intimate moments. Those are my favorite biopics to see. But some that come to mind that do that very well are, I think, films like The Social Network, written by Aaron Sorkin. Mark Zuckerberg has been very public about how he disagrees with his portrayal in that film, but
and that is the best endorsement of that movie.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example. Jesse Eisenberg gives such a great performance, as does Andrew Garfield as Eduardo Saverin, and they show those kind of human moments for those characters, and that Mark Zuckerberg could be a monster sometimes.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
The Zuck don't like that.
The Social Network is my favorite movie, and I think it's a perfect movie. I think it's the best movie of the last decade by a wide margin, and there are many, many, many good movies that came out within the decade. It's a decade.
I'm pretty sure like Ice Age 4 and 5 came out in that decade, Flynn. That's a stretch.
Right? But, I think that everybody that worked on the Social Network did their job literally as well as they could have. David Fincher is sort of precise and surgical in the way he directs it, and injects a kind of like coldness, and it feels very like sterile. The color palette has a lot of like toned down blues and oranges that I really like. Like you mentioned, Jesse Eisenberg is Mark Zuckerberg, so good, so detached, while still feeling human, still feeling like, that he can't connect despite attempts, however authentic. Andrew Garfield is Eduardo Saverin, so passionate. Justin Timberlake is as Sean Parker, so over the top, jerkish.
I never thought I'd
Hollywood.
hate JT.
He's fantastic in that movie. Armie Hammer, as both Winklevosses, the Winklevi. Aaron Sorkin's script, it just moves at a clip. It's so fast, it's so clever, and I feel like that kind of movie plays to his strengths, as I'm sure we'll get into again. And the score by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross is perfect for what it needed to be. So I just think that The Social Network is sort of this great example of a movie where everybody working in conjunction with each other is kind of like at their peak of what they can do, and it resulted in something that's incredible.
I think something that like while you were talking, I thought of too was a good biopic not only shows the person's life but how they affected everybody else's lives too, and like the Zuck affected a lot of people, and he did it overnight.
Yeah,
and then over a year it was even more, and then here we are where I feel like they could make a Social Network too based off of everything that's happened since that movie came out.
Yeah, and I think you get as much about what you need to know about Mark Zuckerberg, or what that movie wants you to know about Mark Zuckerberg, through his interactions with other people, through his handling of the situation with Eduardo and sort of desire to toss him to the side, and his interactions with the Winklevoss twins in depositions and their lawyer. You kind of like get so much of that by how other people are reacting to him and how other people see him, and you sort of get this great feeling from Jesse Eisenberg, like, how am I the bad guy, when every other character is able to realize pretty quickly that he's the bad guy.
Yeah, definitely. Moving into some other movies on the list that we had, another Aaron Sorkin favorite of mine is Molly's Game, the true story about Molly Bloom. I never thought that I'd find another movie about poker that was more interesting than Casino Royale, for me. And here I am, and Idris Elba, Kevin Costner. It's such a great cast. Michael Cera's in this movie too. But this is Aaron Sorkin's directorial debut, and this is very quickly going to turn into an Aaron Sorkin episode, I think. But I love
you, Aaron.
Molly's Game. Yeah, Molly's Game is similar to what you were just talking about in The Social Network, where we see these characters kind of reacting to her, and you're informed about that main character by the supporting characters, which is something that Sorkin does so well with his scripts, and something that he did really well in his directing. And I think he took a lot of notes from both Danny Boyle on Steve Jobs and David Fincher on The Social Network.
Speaking of Steve Jobs.
Yeah, speaking of that turtleneck loving man.
My favorite movie of all time, Steve Jobs.
So here we are with another Aaron Sorkin movie.
Yeah,
and that's a great one too. And David Fincher was in the running to direct that movie, and it's kind of clear why, with how well him and Sorkin's work kind of meshed with Social Network. But I think that Danny Boyle did a really good job. And as we sort of touched on in the beginning, the 3-act structure, the sort of unconventional way of telling the story, works really, really well, I think, in that movie.
It was my first time ever watching it last night, and I just did not know that's how they did it at all. And going into it, I was like, oh, I'm going to see Steve Jobs' life. And I'm like, no, I'm going to see Steve Jobs' work, which was his life. And like that's why it was very cool and very different. And also, I thought that without spoiling things, basically the way it went, where there was 3 different tech launches in the movie, how he interacted with each character at each tech launch, like that developed those characters' relationships better than any movies I've ever seen before, where like you could see them at just this one moment from, like, I think the first one was 84, the second one was 88 or 89, and the third one was 98.
Yeah.
Where like from those 3 time periods, those 3 stretches, those 3 tech launches, this is Steve Jobs, and you could see the difference in him.
Yeah.
Not just the looks, just the character. And like if you told me that it was just 3 scenes at 3 different points in 3 different years, I would not have believed that.
Yeah.
But that's Sorkin's writing.
Right.
Yeah.
And you still sort of get a microcosm of who he was, the version that the movie tells of who Steve Jobs was as a person to other people, as sort of this cultural giant. And I think it's a really fascinating way to tell that story.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about Steve Jobs and about Aaron Sorkin's scripts in general are that they ultimately are about real things that we all kind of go through. So yes, these movies are about these larger-than-life people, but they all went through very human, very real situations. You talk about The Social Network. That's about the crumbling of a friendship. Molly's Game and Steve Jobs are both about a broken father-daughter relationship. And I think that's what kind of, in turn, makes these characters so interesting when you're watching. And Steve Jobs is a perfect movie, and it's my favorite movie. So
I love that we happen to do a biopic episode and both your favorite movies come up. Yeah.
Yeah. Both Aaron Sorkin 10.
Yeah.
You like Sorkin.
So speaking of that, one of the movies that I put on my list, which I don't know if as many people consider it a biopic, but like it is Moneyball.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about Billy Beane and
Yeah.
how he changed baseball.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
that was the thing I was touching on earlier, where it's not always a larger than life figure, because most people didn't know the once first round pick phenom 5-tool player Billy Beane, who flamed out and ended up on the Mets. Like, not many people knew him before this movie, but he literally changed the sport of baseball.
Yeah.
And that movie, again, Aaron Sorkin, shout out, dude, come on this podcast. But like, that movie is so well done, and it's like, yeah, it's about the Oakland Athletics and the season they had, but it's about Billy. It's about Billy's life, his family, his relationship with his mom, his relationship, or not his mom, his relationship with his family, and like his wife, his daughter, and then his relationship with Jonah Hill's character, and then the team itself. And I mean, a baseball season is a long season. Spring training starts in February, and the season, if you're in playoffs, ends in October. So like, that's the whole time period of the movie, is the end of one season to the end of the next. And I think that movie does a really good job showcasing this character and what he did in his life, like his field.
Yeah. Yeah. Another that, I don't know if you would call it a biopic, but certainly based on a true story that I picked out was Zodiac. Another David Fincher movie.
Do you like David Fincher?
Yeah, I do. I do like David Fincher quite a bit. But Zodiac is so interesting to me because you sort of get stylistically different takes on sort of the Zodiac killings as time goes on. I think the cast is really great. I think that Jake Gyllenhaal playing Robert Graysmith is one of these characters that David Fincher loves to flesh out, which are sort of these characters that are so obsessive about what they're doing that they don't care about how it impacts the people around them. That's certainly true of Mark Zuckerberg and the Social Network. And it's true of Robert Graysmith here, who becomes so obsessive with determining who the Zodiac killer is in his own capacity. And you see him working harder at it than the police around him, to the point where they, sort of, Mark Ruffalo is Dave Toschi. It's just like, dude, let it.
I gotta watch this movie.
Let it go.
Yeah,
Right.
I do.
And it's almost 3 hours, but it doesn't feel like it at all. It flies by, and it covers so much of the hysteria around the Zodiac. It's kind of this time capsule of what police work was like even then, when data wasn't as great and tools on the crime scene weren't as great, trying to figure out who did it. And I think another interesting thing about Zodiac is David Fincher kind of indicts Arthur Lee Allen, and is kind of like, okay, he died before we were able to truly determine
if he was the killer,
whether he was the Zodiac. But the movie kind of ends telling you, like, yeah, from the perspective of this story, it was him. And I think that's a fascinating way to go about it, because I think that a lot of people would kind of avoid that. We don't know for sure who the Zodiac killer was. It's an open case. But David Fincher, in telling this true story, did not leave it open, even though he doesn't flat out say, yeah, it was him. We have a scene with Robert Graysmith kind of confronting him, and you get like, yeah, I knew for myself. So.
Yeah.
Was Ted Cruz in that movie?
Ted Cruz, well, depending. Some of the scenes masked, maybe.
Robert Downey Jr. was amazing in that movie.
Yes.
That was right before he really hit his stride with Iron Man.
Yeah, it was 2007.
Yeah, so.
It was when he did Kiss Kiss Bang Bang too.
Yeah. A more recent biopic that has quickly become one of my favorites, that kind of like all the ones that we've mentioned here, follows these larger than life characters and people, is Rocket Man.
Oh, I was wrong.
Yeah. Ford v Ferrari's coming up.
Okay.
But Rocket Man, I think you might consider to be more of a by the numbers biopic. We see Elton John's childhood, and we see him growing up and becoming Elton John. But it's told in a really interesting way. It almost plays out. Well, it does play out like a straight up musical. You know, there are really large numbers in the movie.
I mean, how else could you tell Elton John's life
Yeah,
story?
yeah. Well, you could be like Bohemian Rhapsody. And
I wasn't gonna bring that up this episode.
That's not
'Cause,
on
you know,
any of our lists.
Directly changing a person's life and a huge aspect of their life and why people look up to them is kind of a no-no.
yeah,
And, you know, I'm not knocking any of the actors. I think they
Sure.
did a good job.
yeah.
And, like, the scene where they wrote Bohemian Rhapsody was dope. But, like, you know, moving on. Let's talk about good movies.
Well, you know what I was going to say that completely contradicts Bohemian Rhapsody is that the directors here, like David Fincher with The Social Network, Zodiac, you know, and you look at and Dexter Fletcher with Rocketman, these directors took painstaking efforts to make their movies as authentic as possible
Yeah.
and tell true stories.
True.
Yeah.
And you look at movies like Steve Jobs, where people have come out and said, like, that's not how it went down. But Aaron Sorkin's defense is that this is how it would have gone down.
Right.
And these are the issues that Steve was having with these people throughout his entire career. So, yes,
Yeah.
we tell it in a story of a 3-act structure, 3 different launch events. These conversations may never have happened at these launch events, but they happened, you know?
Right.
And that, to me, is what makes a perfect biopic, is when you can tell the story as truly as you can, while also making it entertaining, you know?
There's certainly the tagline for Rocketman was based on a true fantasy,
Yeah.
I believe. And, you know, Elton John was not floating in concerts or anything, but even so, that's not the point of the movie. That's not the point the movie sets out to make. And so in that regard, I think that just an authenticity is so much more valuable than being like, okay, well, here's exactly where this person was at this time, and this is exactly what they said, because nobody is ever going to confirm or deny anything that makes them look bad in a movie. So, you know, kind of like, and really digging at what matters. Like we talked about with Social Network, Mark Zuckerberg does not like that movie. You're bringing up with Steve Jobs, people are saying it didn't happen that way. But I think that's because these movies kind of strike a nerve when it's like that. But very positive biopic. Another one that came out last year is A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood from Marielle Heller. And that's another unconventional structure. It's sort of told sometimes, like the set design is in a Mr. Rogers episode, and it's told through the eyes of a journalist that's writing a piece on Mr. Rogers about heroes. But Tom Hanks is so good, so empathetic as Mr. Rogers, and I feel like it was a really valuable movie at the time it came out when things seemed so negative, and you really want somebody like Mr. Rogers to be there telling everybody that it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this movie did for me, and I thought it was really great.
Hell yeah, it did. I loved that movie.
Yeah.
And like you said, it came out at the exact right time too. I mean, usually movies like that time of year, they're not always the happiest. It's Oscar season. It's dark, bleak, scary movies. And then here's Tom Hanks just telling you everything's going to be okay. But I think the fact that they did it from the writer's point of view is why it was such a great movie.
Right.
Where I don't think any of us want to know what Mr. Rogers' life was like 24/7 from his point of view.
Yeah.
But seeing how somebody who was so close-minded was impacted by him, and that's the exact people he wanted to impact,
Right.
that was why it was such an impactful movie.
Yeah, I think it came out back-to-back 2018. There was the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And, again, taking very different approaches to tell people's lives. But that's the point of a biopic, is to tell a version of somebody's life like this, rather than we have a documentary with real interviews and the real people and things like that. And they're just different ways to sort of tell the same story, I think.
Because those movies came out back to back, we're running out of good Mr. Rogers movie names. Like, what else can we do now?
Yeah. Two biopics. I don't know if you would call them biopics, but they are certainly based on true stories that tell the story as truthfully as they can, are Spotlight and Dark Waters. And I wanted to combine these because Mark Ruffalo has really solidified himself as this producer and actor who wants to tell these stories that are really difficult to watch. But for some reason, like I've gone back and rewatched Spotlight because I think it is
Spotlight
a great
is
film.
amazing.
Yeah. And there are these films that condemn perpetrators and monsters and tell the stories so well and truthfully.
It's a story that needs to be told that most people wouldn't dare touch.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that what they do for bringing justice to the victims and telling their stories, and again, like I said, condemning perpetrators and monsters. Like Dark Waters condemns an entire corporation. Spotlight condemns terrible priests. Like, and really the industry church. Like,
Yeah.
But those are the films I think, like I said, are tough to watch, but are also like so well done, and films that we need. I think films that the general public probably they wouldn't have known about these situations or these stories had there not been a film about it.
Well,
So,
what you just described perfectly describes another one on my list, Schindler's List.
Yes.
Because everything you just said applies to that, where most people would have never known his story. Most people would have never known, like, his little chunk of history and how he helped people and how not everybody there was bad. And it's a difficult movie to watch, but it's a certainly very impactful movie.
Yeah, and in the same vein, one of my picks was The Report. Scott C. Burns movie about Dan Jones and the torture report, and everything you're saying about bringing to light something that is underreported, sort of because of the powers that be are paying and making sure it stays that way, and shedding light on it in a really fascinating, infuriating, kind of motivate you to act type of way, and motivate you to want to change things and fight despite the odds being very long, to continue to try and sort of bend the curve towards justice and transparency and things like that. I think that's something The Report did really well, and Adam Driver, again, one of these central performances of a real person that brings a sort of like raw, authentic aspect to the performance.
Worth mentioning, Dark Waters and The Report are both movies from 2019 that I think they're on Amazon Prime now, or at least The Report definitely is. So they're definitely worth seeing, because I think they almost play out like documentaries. It's crazy. So
I got a couple that I can group. So one thing that I think is important with biopics is that they talk about important issues, especially about time periods they came out in. So the movies I'm going to say are Remember the Titans, Just Mercy, and Straight Outta Compton, because they all deal with civil rights and different time periods too. Where Remember the Titans, I think, is one of the best movies I've ever seen in my life. Coach Herman Boone, that's his story. Denzel Washington plays an amazing character in that movie, and it talks about something that I feel like everybody should know, that at one point that was what high school was like. That was real. Like, that was a reality in this country. Now, for us growing up, we would have never imagined that. But that movie, as like a timepiece in, what is it, the 70s, I think, like early 70s, late 60s. It's like a viewing glass into what this was once like, just when our parents were in high school or when our grandparents were. So I think that's really effective. And then in the same vein, Just Mercy and Straight Outta Compton are about civil rights in the 90s, following these characters. Like, I don't remember the lawyer's name, but Michael B. Jordan's character in Just Mercy, like, he literally chose to be a death row inmate lawyer in the South, and like everybody thought he was insane, and his work is still affecting people's lives now in a positive way. And I think that's amazing. And then Straight Outta Compton, most people are just like, oh, it's a movie about a rap group. No, it's not. It is a movie about adversity. It is a movie about civil rights. It's a movie about standing up for what you believe in, because they wrote some pretty controversial music, but those guys came from nothing. Like, they came from nothing, and they rose to this platform where they spoke what their people had to say, which was insane. And like, that movie has some crazy intense tension. Like, the scenes that they have, like, there's one where they're just recording their album and they're out on the sidewalk and they just get stopped and harassed by police for no reason. They're not doing anything. And like, it's not like, maybe that exact situation didn't happen, but like, we're talking about, where
Yeah.
this was their life and this happened to them in some capacity. This was just the movie's version of it.
That situation is true for millions of people,
And it's still happening now.
Yeah, and I think that as a group, there's sort of a misrepresentation, and biopics like this can serve to correct the record. And one line that has stuck with me from Straight Outta Compton since the first trailer came out is O'Shea Jackson as Ice Cube says, "Our art is a reflection of our reality," and I thought that was so powerful, so real, and such a great line. And I actually have a couple civil rights biopics too, and they're Malcolm X, Spike Lee's sort of monumental take on Malcolm, starring Denzel Washington, who I think he gives his best performance of his career.
Shout out to Denzel
in that movie. And Selma, which is about Selma, the march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but is kind of sold. Ava DuVernay's biopic is kind of sold as the Martin Luther King Jr. biopic, and I think that both of these movies are really interesting because we have one civil rights figure in Martin Luther King Jr. that has been kind of elevated and is kind of safe. We have another in Malcolm X that has been kind of denigrated and sort of misrepresented as the person he is, when both were very complex men, which with very complex takes on the issues that plagued their country. And I think that both these movies are so interesting because what both Ava DuVernay and Spike Lee set out to do is paint a real picture. So Selma is not as rosy about Martin Luther King Jr. As you might expect, and Malcolm X is not, all negative. It paints a complete picture of a real, genuine person. And I think that especially when you have movies about black figures, iconic figures, Selma and Malcolm X kind of demonstrate the value of having black storytellers tell these stories, and getting sort of real, not sanitized history class, what is most convenient to tell. And so I think that both of those movies are incredibly valuable for doing that.
I feel like all 5 movies we just mentioned really are important in that sense, where like they were stories that if Hollywood didn't change its ways would have never been told. And if people like Spike Lee didn't get a chance to do that. And that's another thing about biopics, is that movies are important culturally for people just to see things they relate to and they go through. And when it's a movie about something that's real, they need to see these important figures that are from their life, from their culture. And the fact that they can get made is amazing. They should, and there should be more stories told like this. Yeah.
I'll throw one more in there that applies to all of that. Another Spike Lee movie, Black Klansman.
Oh, yeah.
That is an amazing movie.
Oh, my God.
And a true story, too, which is crazy to me.
It blows my mind.
That movie, it might be, I know there's movies with more tension, but for me, it's one, the first time I watched it, there was so much tension watching that. I was so stressed out watching that movie.
Yeah, because you really didn't know where it was going to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that movie is so fascinating on the commentary of racial divide. You have David Duke as a character in this movie, which Topher Grace plays.
Oh my God, Topher Grace.
phenomenally, with a kind of bumbling idiocy that is perfect to capture the ridiculousness of the Ku Klux Klan. I think the way that movie the way that movie paints that portrait is so great, and it's a sort of version of art fighting back, just despite it being a true story that takes place in the past, being real. And sort of the conversation of, Adam Driver's character says, for you it's a crusade, for me it's a job. And he sort of gets the response from John David Washington of, you're Jewish. You hear them saying, all these things about Judaism, about how you're not a real white person if you're Jewish. How can this not be personal for you too? And so just like in such a short span of time, being able to, in one conversation, a couple of back and forths, being able to kind of discuss the problems of like solidarity of the oppressed and where privilege comes in and what blind spots that creates is why Spike Lee is kind of this artist of immense talent that can kind of like touch on these things like so subtly and be able to say so much with so little.
Yeah.
Imagine having Spike Lee as the biggest fan of your team and you don't treat him right and make him not want to come to your games at the Knicks. You're a sad franchise.
Sell the team Dolan.
Yeah, sell the team Dolan. No one wants you to have it anymore. Spike Lee, you're great. Come on the podcast. Yeah, Black Klansman, man. That movie, it hits different.
It does. Well, we could be here all day talking about these, but I figured maybe we'll just rattle off a couple more that are just our kind of favorites. I'm definitely going to lean towards Ford v Ferrari.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely not like a full-on biopic, but it tells a true story, and I don't think anyone would have known Ken Miles' name without seeing Ford v Ferrari, because he does not get credit for winning that race. So, Ford v Ferrari for me. I love The Imitation Game. I, Tonya, starring Margot Robbie as Tanya Harding. That's a cool story. Deepwater Horizon. Did you guys see that? That was really cool. The story about the BP oil spill. I think it's Mark Wahlberg's best performance. Those are some of mine that come to mind.
Theory of Everything.
Oh, yeah.
I think was a great movie. Eddie Redmayne, really awesome as Stephen Hawking. Then the rest on my list were said. So
a couple more to touch on. Goodfellas, again, another sort of unconventionally, don't think it's a biopic, but Henry Hill is a real person. And as far back as he could remember, he always wanted to be a gangster. And Marty Scorsese again has a knack, Raging Bull as well, of telling stories about flawed people and the way they impact other people's lives. And then the other one I wanted to mention was Lincoln. It's long, it's dry, but Daniel Day-Lewis becomes Abraham Lincoln in that movie. It's insane.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that you think it's better than Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter?
Marginal at best. But again, despite being long, I think Steven Spielberg kind of goes to great lengths to tell a really interesting story about somebody who's sort of consensus considered historically perhaps the greatest president. That's a different debate, but I think that Spielberg does a great job, and Daniel Day-Lewis's performance in that should be marveled at by everyone forever.
That's another thing about these is like it's a look into history of like a broad sense. It's not always like history books in classrooms, but like history. Like this happened. Yeah. This was real, and it was at a time period where you were not there in their shoes and their walk of life. And that's why it's like really cool to watch these.
Yeah, and to cap off, that's why, and I think that all of the artists, the directors that we mentioned kind of understand this, why they have an immense responsibility when telling these stories. Again, to not paint the full picture, every nook and cranny, every detail, every word in every conversation, but to make sure they're as accurate as possible, because people take it as gospel. So you don't want to be misrepresenting things in an irresponsible way. And I think that all of these directors kind of get that. So. Yeah,
definitely. Well, that wraps up our little discussion on biopics and movies based on true stories. There are a ton of great ones that we did not mention here.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm
feel
sure
like some that like movie lovers would like be so angry.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
We didn't say like Lawrence of Arabia.
Call us out in the comments below.
Yeah, be mad at us, please.
And follow us on Letterboxd. We'll have our links in the description. Yeah. So, thanks for watching and thanks for listening. I'm Gianni.
I'm Flynn.
And I'm Luke.
And we'll see you next time.